All right, so the best fiscal plan in the Western world, and that's the subject of the riff. My friend and former Trump first-term colleague Stephen Miller, now the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy in the second term, calls it the most essential piece of legislation in the Western world. Of course, he's referring to President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, which is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to deliver on his core promises to lower taxes, secure the border, and rein in spending. By the way, Steve Miller will be here on the show tomorrow afternoon. Now, in Mr. Miller's various ex-Twitter posts, he makes a bunch of key points. But I want to focus on some budget math. Seems to be poorly understood by some of our conservative friendlies in the Senate. First, even the CBO concedes that the House bill reduces mandatory spending by about $1.7 trillion. Now, these are the mandatory program savings from cutting waste, fraud, and abuse and restoring appropriate eligibility requirements, especially for able-bodied males without dependents. Then, the CBO argues that extending the Trump tax cuts will cost $3.7 trillion, and that leaves an increase in the deficit of about $2.5 trillion. This is back-of-the-envelope stuff. But wait a minute. Extending the Trump tax cuts and even adding about $300 billion in new tax cuts can't possibly increase the deficit. Look, 7 years ago, the CBO underscored Trump tax cut-related revenues by $2.3 trillion. In other words, actual revenues came in $2.3 trillion above CBO estimates. This is over the past 7 years. So why won't this happen again? In fact, 100% bonus depreciation expensing for businesses likely to produce an enormous growth dividend. New factories, machinery, equipment, R&D all make the economy even growthier. Working folks, wages, business profits will be going up, and at lower tax rates, perhaps even the 15% Made in America corporate tax revenues will climb rapidly. The point is, as Mr. Miller makes clear, that the CBO's estimate of a higher deficit from Trump policies rests on their false assumption that extending tax cuts and even adding some new tax cut wrinkles will increase the deficit. But it didn't the last time. Why will it in the future? Answer, it won't. And Mr. Miller adds that when libertarians attack the deficit impact of the bill, they're actually really attacking the tax cut. Now, vetoing the bill would leave the GOP responsible for a $4 trillion some odd tax hike. That would be political malpractice of the worst kind. So let me just rework the numbers a wee bit. Judging from the last 7 years of higher tax revenues from the original Trump tax cuts, I'm going to extrapolate the $2.3 trillion CBO miss into a roughly $3 trillion revenue increase over 10 years. Then I'm going to plug in $1.7 trillion in mandatory savings, which the CBO basically agrees with. So that gives me $4.7 trillion in lower deficits over the next 10 years. Call it $5 trillion, just to use round numbers here, all right? That represents $5 trillion in deficit reduction, a far cry from the CBO estimate of a $2.5 trillion deficit increase. Unfortunately, even that pro-growth deficit reduction plan of lower spending and lower taxes will not eliminate the deficit. I get that. As Senator James Lankford said on this show last night, quote, "We're not going to pay off the jumbo mortgage in just 1 year." But lower spending, faster growth, bigger growth dividends would, in fact, constitute, as Mr. Miller says, the best plan in the Western world. And that is the riff.